The buzz of the fluorescent lights above seemed to echo in the silence of the lockup, a low hum that made everything feel just a bit more claustrophobic. It was late, nearly 2 a.m., and most of the inmates had settled into a restless slumber, the occasional murmur or shuffle breaking the silence. In the holding cells of the police station, time seemed to stand still, as though it had nowhere to go. Jake Reaper Lawson sat in a metal chair in one of the smaller rooms, leaning back with his arms crossed. His dark leather vest, emblazoned with the insignia of the Devil's Rage MC, gleamed under the dim light. The tough exterior that usually defined him, the rough and ready biker who lived by the throttle, was now gone. In its place, there was something colder, something more deliberate, something dangerous. He had never thought he'd end up in this situation. He had been on a routine run heading back from a trip to deliver some special cargo to a contact in the city. But somehow, fate had conspired against him. A couple of too quick turns and he'd ended up on the wrong side of a speeding ticket. Then a scuffle. Then a confrontation. Before he knew it, the police had him in cuffs and were taking him in for questioning. Jake wasn't a fool. He knew this wasn't just about a speeding ticket. He could feel the tension in the air, the whispers. He was a biker, an outsider to the clean-cut uniforms that surrounded him. A reputation had followed him here, and the cops weren't too pleased about it. Maybe they'd been hoping to take him down a notch. Maybe they were looking for a reason to make an example of him. But Jake didn't flinch. He had seen worse in his time as a soldier in Iraq. He had faced enemies that didn't hesitate to pull the trigger. The cops in this station? They were just a minor inconvenience. He was about to find out just how wrong that assessment was. A few feet away, in the larger holding area, the low murmur of conversation among the other prisoners was broken by the sound of boots stomping across the concrete floor. 3 men appeared in the doorway, their presence as heavy as the air that suddenly seemed to thicken. The leader, a towering figure with a scruffy beard and patched jacket, stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Jake with an unsettling focus. His name was Vance, the head of a notorious local motorcycle gang known as the Reapers, a rival club to Jake's own Devil's Rage. Vance had been making a name for himself, trying to assert his dominance in the underworld. The tension between the two clubs had always been simmering, but now it felt like it might boil over. Jake's eyes narrowed as Vance's gaze scanned the room, taking in the other prisoners and the police officers who milled about, seemingly indifferent to the potential storm that was about to unfold. The police had made the mistake of throwing a wolf into the lion's den. "Hey, soldier boy," Vance called out, his voice loud and mocking, enough to draw the attention of the other prisoners. "Got lost on your way to the battlefield? Maybe you've been out of the game too long. These civilians probably don't know how to handle a badass like you." Jake's fingers twitched, the instinct to lash out rising in his chest, but he held his ground. He didn't respond right away. He just studied Vance, weighing the situation. This wasn't just a casual jab. Vance was looking to make trouble, to assert control over the space. Jake could feel it in the way the air had changed, thick with unspoken hostility. "I'm not your problem, Vance," Jake finally said, his voice low but firm. "So why don't you get back to your boys and leave me alone?" Vance didn't take kindly to the response. The man was used to having people fall in line, to having his words feared, and Jake wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. The air crackled with the tension as Vance stepped forward, his boots grinding against the concrete. His cronies flanked him, their eyes glaring at Jake like hungry wolves closing in on their prey. "You really think you can talk to me like that, soldier?" Vance's voice was a low growl now, full of venom. "You don't get to come into my town, walk into my lockup, and disrespect me in front of my crew. No one does. Not even a washed-up soldier like you." Jake's jaw tightened, his mind flashing back to the years he had spent in the heat of battle. He wasn't afraid of this man. He had fought in places where death could come from any direction, at any time. Vance and his crew? They were just another problem to be solved. "You think I'm scared of you?" Jake said, his voice colder than the steel walls around them. "You don't know the first thing about fear. So take your boys and go back to whatever corner of this town you crawled out of. This is my fight, not yours." Vance's lips twisted into a cruel grin. "You really don't get it, do you?" He turned to his men. "Take him down." Before Jake could react, the two other members of Vance's crew lunged at him. But Jake was faster. His military training kicked in, his instincts honed from years of combat. The first man, a lanky thug with tattoos creeping up his neck, swung a wild punch at Jake's face. Jake sidestepped effortlessly, grabbed the thug's wrist, and with a sharp twist, sent him crashing to the floor, his scream echoing through the room. The second man, a stockier figure, tried to rush in from the side, but Jake had already anticipated the move. He planted his foot firmly, spun around, and delivered a brutal elbow to the man's ribs. The air left the thug's lungs in a sharp exhale as he crumpled to the ground. In a matter of seconds, the two men were out of commission, sprawled on the floor, groaning in pain. Vance's grin faltered, replaced by a look of disbelief. He hadn't expected the soldier to be this fast, this skilled. But there was no backing down now. He charged forward, throwing a series of punches with the reckless abandon of a man who thought his size alone would intimidate his opponent. Jake's movements were fluid, precise. He dodged each blow, his body a perfect extension of his training. He stepped to the side, caught Vance's arm, and in one fluid motion, threw the larger man over his shoulder. Vance hit the ground with a sickening thud, his face contorted in pain. The room fell silent. Jake stood over Vance, breathing heavily, his body alive with adrenaline. He didn't say a word. His eyes, cold and unblinking, were fixed on Vance. The message was clear: this wasn't Vance's town. Not anymore. But the real shock came next. From the corner of the room, one of the officers, who had been watching the fight unfold, stepped forward. He was tall, clean-shaven, with a hardened look that suggested he had seen his fair share of chaos. "Jake Lawson," the officer said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "You've just made a very bad decision." Jake turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "I didn't start this." The officer stepped closer, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. "Maybe not, but you've sure as hell finished it. And now you're going to answer for it." Jake didn't flinch. He had been in tight situations before. But this was different. The officer wasn't here to arrest him. He was here to make an example out of him. It was clear now that the whole thing had been a setup. The cops had planned to let Vance and his crew provoke Jake into fighting so they could bring him down. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly anticipated, was that Jake was more than just a biker. He was a soldier, and soldiers don't back down. As the officer approached, Jake's muscles tensed, but his mind was already racing. There was a way out of this. There always was. With a sudden, calculated movement, he spun, grabbing a loose piece of metal from the floor and tossing it toward the officer. The officer flinched, just long enough for Jake to grab his jacket and yank him off balance. The officer's gun clattered to the floor as Jake threw him against the wall. Jake moved quickly, disarming the situation before the other officers could react. Within moments, he was back on his feet, his resolve stronger than ever. As he strode toward the exit, leaving chaos in his wake, Jake knew this wouldn't be the last time he clashed with the system. But he was a soldier, and he always finished what he started. By morning, Jake Lawson was gone. The cops were left with their wounded pride, a few busted-up gang members, and the undeniable truth that the wrong man had been locked up. The message had been sent. The Reapers had messed with the wrong soldier. And in this town, that would cost them.